Good evening, everyone. Hi. I'm Victoria Cornelius. I'm on the board, and I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. It is a great honor to have her come and speak on the topic of the healing power of form, summoning the unified field, a path toward healing. Gilah Yelin Hirsch is our speaker tonight. And in reading about her, her diversity and interests are far-reaching. She has so many experiences, and the key, I think, going back to the sheet, you don't usually see these type of professions and abilities in one person. She is a painter, a writer, a theorist, a filmmaker, a lecturer, and a professor of art. Currently, her archives are housed in the Smithsonian Archives. So it's very important for us to realize that this diversity focuses on art and healing. And so I want to read from her talk at what she did when she was 10 years old. Already a profound questioner at the age of 10, Hirsch wrote to Albert Einstein asking how he could reconcile being the greatest scientist in the world while, as she had read, believing in the wrathful God of the Old Testament. His reply included this advice: try to form your opinions always according to your own judgment. This simple yet startling exhortation became the guiding meter of her life. So we have someone who had the wherewithal to write to the smartest man in the world to ask his opinion, and he gave a quick reply. So it is with great delight to have you here, and quite an honor for us to hear her speak about her diversity and the impact it's had on the world and on our work. Please welcome her.
Well, the honor is all mine, and I've been present at all of the talks, and I have learned so much. And I think I'm adding another dimension. I know I am adding another dimension to what I already know. And I'm very grateful to all of you who are providing this kind of special education for me. Now, in the past 2 days, we have been cleansed, cleared, and sanctified. We've been led through inspirational guided imagery, have been instructed on how to manage viruses and much more. I hope you are not too tired for pants. And I thank Joel for that. So, hoping that you're not too tired for pants, I will proceed. There's a word in Hebrew that means both terror and revelation. And this is something that is a property of form. The root of it is or, light, and or conjugates to become to see, lirot, to mirror, mara, and the homonym is female teacher. Recognition of form in art and healing are all processes, reciprocal and shared. They depend on reflection, connection, and contact. Art is an array of frequencies of light, color, consciously or unconsciously aligned into form. Form is a vehicle of frequency. Art works much like a laser, often used as a precise medical tool. I was a questioner from earliest childhood. I grew up in Montreal. At 6, I wrote a published essay called Enigma, questioning how we were at the height of civilization and we still couldn't deal with love, food, and shelter. And we still can't. My father was suffering from a degenerative neurological disease for 13 years, and I stayed home from school to take care of him. My mother was a famous writer, author, poet, but suffered severe mental illness and later diagnosed after her death as borderline personality behavior. And any of you who are familiar with that know that someone can be a genius, brilliant, and can be extremely punitive and in physical, emotional, and mental ways. And those who are closest to the person will be beat up all the time. And I was at 5 and 6 years old reading the newspaper. The Korean War was going on. And all I knew was suffering and starvation and genocide and displacement. I could not make sense of the world. At the same time, I was sent to a 4-language school. And that was English, French, Yiddish, and Hebrew, half a day each, or half a day for 2. And I was studying the Torah. And I asked my Orthodox teacher, how come the names and pronouns for God were both male and female? But we only referred to God as he, and this I found incomprehensible. So as I questioned him, he ran down the aisle, he picked me up by the hair, he threw me out, and I was never allowed back. And that was the beginning of my feminist stance. So many years later, in '99, I made a painting of a female Torah. And I only wrote the words Kol Isha, voice of a woman, inside the Torah, the female Torah, dressed in a negligee, inside a pearl arc, easily untied. The voice of a woman is not to be heard by a man because that would distract him from studying Torah. So I was determined women should read Torah. And then at 10, still unsatisfied, I wasn't getting the answers. I should have waited until this week. I would have found some answers. I wrote to Albert Einstein, and I asked him how he could reconcile being the greatest scientist in the world, and as I had read, he believed in the God of the Old Testament, who created all this suffering and all this wrath and all this misery and all of that which I found so difficult to absorb as a child. And within 2 weeks, I received this letter, and the main line was, try to form your opinions always according to your own judgment. He died 2 weeks after that. I'm not saying cause and effect here, but I have ever been grateful for that answer, which became the guide of my life, and it's something I've tried to teach everywhere. Trust your own judgment. 27 years later, I was invited to Princeton to give a talk on my theory on the origin of alphabet, and they took me to his house and the desk on which he had written that letter 27 years earlier. It was quite a moment of reconciliation. As a child, I was sent to summer camp in the Laurentian Mountains outside of Montreal. And while my bunkmates were playing kickball and thinking about felt poodle skirts, I had brought with me Goethe and Jung and Freud and Cousin Jacques, and later on Simone de Beauvoir, Sabina Spielrein, Alexandra David Neal, and Emily Carr. And these were my heroes. And as much as I could gain with my young mind, I was thrilled every day when I went off to the forest alone and read as much as I could from all of these people. And they formed my life also, or at least they formed an independent thinking life. So Jewish Montreal, the concept of Oriental was pretty lean. It had only to do with Chinese food. And only when I got to New York at 14 did I first see multiple cultures, people of color, ethnicities, and I knew that I had been living in a tiny sliver, a very sheltered life, and that the rest of my life would entail examining the world as much as I could. I hoped to grow up to be a writer and psychologist. Eventually, and accidentally, I became a multi-hatted artist. What we see is what we are, is how artists see the world. The artist aligns frequencies into form and image and causes psychophysiological change. The artist is a medium between spiritual and material worlds who uses a medium to layer veils of light and shadow to produce illusions, dimensions, reflection, refraction evident in a matrix of frequency. Scientists, however, gather changing information from the material and intellectual worlds to explain the presence of substance by measuring illusions of dimension, reflection, refraction, evident in a matrix of frequency. Artists and shamans transform by conjuring. The artist transfigures the medium into form to alter states of mind and body, and both the artist and the viewer. The shaman and lama and healer and priest also alter states, mind or body, through visual and oral performance. Sequenced ritual is key to all and may be either private or public. The artist brings abstraction into form, and the scientist brings form into abstraction. So that is a complementary relationship that few really learn in that way. Usually it's a segregated event. You're either an artist or a scientist, and there's no connection between the two. But in fact, one depends on the other and vice versa. So I began painting in 1968, not having been a painter before, and I just started with layers of light and space, creating light and space, and after a year, I set up what's called a still life, and as soon as I began to look at these vegetables, everyday stuff, I realized that anytime there's any more than one thing adjacent to another, there's a relationship set up, and there's a dynamic set up. And there's a metaphor that can be set up, and I saw this progression of vegetables as the exodus from Egypt. Now, that's a wild thought, but I have thought in these ways, as do poets and artists always. So, apophenia, I'm going to present this idea to you because I was shocked when I came across it. It was coined by a psychiatrist in the 50s, and he said that this is the tendency to mistakenly perceive connections and meaning between unrelated things. And this is the road to schizophrenia. And I balk at this because this is the heart of creativity. Someone who is creative will explore the ability to see multiple events in multiple ways, in multiple perspectives. And this is what has made our lives so rich and continues to do so. The cousin of apophenia, pareidolia, talks about specific kinds of things that one might perceive that aren't really in terms of what does really mean there. So in the 60s and 70s, the zeitgeist was a conflation of Eastern philosophy, quantum physics, Gestalt psychology, personal growth centers, mind-expanding drugs, women's movement, sexual liberation, Black liberation, Vietnam War, and protests. And I was a protester. And at the same time, I was understanding more about the plight of women. And I began to move from the vegetable scene to using certain kinds of food elements as symbols of the female at that time. So a very large and juicy red tomato was being captured by this wiry, spiky basket that holds eggs, and the eggs, of course, were symbolic of our biology. So, and I was painting in huge scale, and these paintings were shown in New York in the Whitney Museum, and for some reason they called me a pop artist, but I never was, because I was looking for meaning, and pop artists were looking for decoration. So here is a very large painting also where it's called House Arrest. The eggs are trapping the giant tomato inside. And then as an art historian, I played with multiple images. So instead of angels flying on top, the peach is a Deputy and the punch bowl is the Virgin. And I really looked around in art history and thinking, well, how can we change the metaphor and make it relevant? By splitting images, I could bring associations together. By imagining that there was different layers of glass put onto ordinary still life, I could imagine that this distorted time and space. And I became really interested in distortion of time and space. And also, I began to see that if I could portray realistic images, many on top of each other, all were discrete images, then I could hold many different ideas and truths at the same time. And this harkens back to this morning's wonderful talk, where she had talked about the mindfulness, watching the different events. And I was really pleased to hear that this morning, because you'll see in my work I've been doing it all along. And as these layers got more complicated and more real and more substantial, I realized, as a painter, as a thinker, I could think of anything and give it weight. And the proof had to be in how can I prove something, visually or theoretically. And even something this giant, where I could create the illusion of very substantial, heavy-looking, juicy food, and then just say, just as easily I could peel it off. So that really gave me a process of thinking about life in different ways. This was a really important painting for me, and I began to think that I was using the picture plane to examine personality, and that as I could reveal layers over layers over layers, there was so much to learn and to explore. So in 1974, this is right after that peeling painting, I took my first solo trip in my van to the Sierras and got caught in a blizzard. And after 2 days, I knew if I couldn't move the van, I better start walking, and I started walking. And the last thing I remember is sinking into warm snow. And then after that, nothing. And then apparently 2 days later, I was found miraculously under a snowbank. And that impacted my psyche very much. And I felt that I had to re-examine my psyche. And that new inquiry needed a new form. And so I started to work in circles. And this one came from a dream. I dreamed that I was standing in front of a wash basin in a motel in Fresno, California, where I never have been. And I started pulling a tapeworm from the left side of my thumb palm. And I was fascinated and disgusted by it. And the door opened, a cleaning person came in, and I asked her, "Can you help me with this?" And she said, "No, this is something you must do on your own." And I knew I had much more to examine. And the tapeworm became the serpent, which is the only animal that is below ground, in water, on the ground, and in the air, and mythically always used for discovery of very significant kinds of mythic revelations. And then the serpent became these ribbons, and they became all bound up with no space, hardly any, for moments of respite in a very complicated life. And when the ribbons were exploded, there was room for expansion and freedom. But then I still had to examine once again, and I saw myself as an orange egg that was identified by my attachments. And I looked inside the middle of the egg, and I saw that I was painting 3 very important letters, the Hebrew letters for the first letters for the words for air, fire, water. The letter for air is this red one. The letter for water is this dark blue one. And the fire one is back here. And there were these white spheres that appeared. And when I say, that appeared, I mean it, that appeared. I'm not chasing anything. I have no plan. I let the image tell the story. And then I looked inside my brain with my right eye, and I saw my names in Hebrew inscribed in pomegranate seeds. And then looking further deep, I saw the DNA. And I realized then that wherever there's life, there's at least a vitality that's created by two. You have to have a duality for life to exist. And even further, it became absolutely clear that any life did not exist in isolation at any level. And I knew then that a witness had to be present in order to understand the sense of duality, much like the mindfulness example that was given this morning. And when I painted reflections of events in time, anytime I crossed the DNA, I found the Hebrew letter Aleph, which is the first letter of the alphabet and also signifies the beginning, the source of all things. So I found a merging, a wedding between mysticism and science through the paintings. I felt like I could see through tissue and through marrow. In 1980, I became paralyzed on my left side. I had 2 canvases made in my body size, and I had myself penciled in, facing forward, on both of them. On one of them, I worked on the innards of the body as much as I could feel them and see them intuitively. And after almost a year, it became untangled and I was free. And then I did a rebirth of the spirit over a full-length self-portrait. I learned to trust intuition as it is found and expressed in body-related imagery. The image seemed to go underwater. And even in the reeds, I imagined seeing the word for woman, which is made out of the words for man, woman, fire, God. And the image got deeper. It was as if I was there on the moment of 5th day when the waters and the earth became separated. And not too long after that, I imagined that I was stepping out of the reeds and out of the water, and I found myself at a pond in Southern California. And I was at that pond for 3 years, in different times of day and night, in different seasons, and different patterns. And as I stayed there, pretty much addicted to being there every day, no matter what, I saw, as the reeds broke across the pond, there were certain shapes and forms that captured my attention. And it seemed to me like there was some kind of alphabet being realized over there with the breaking and bending of the reeds. And the alphabet seemed to have angles, lines, X's, arcs, and just captivated me. I was hoping I'd be able to read the scriptural message. But the longer I stayed at the pond, the more I became invested in the reflection rather than that which was reflected. And I got deeper and deeper into the reflection. And again, the question of reality rose. What was real? Was it the stick, or the leaves, or the reflection, or all of it? And I knew then that if heaven and earth could be deep inside the pond, only the floating leaves would give me reference to the reality, the surface, much like human behavior tells us what's going on between 2 rather separated individuals. Soon I began to look at the land with the same kind of intensity that I looked at the pond. High in the mountains of Banff, another period of isolation, I followed the fork in the road as if by the hand of nature, being led to see various secret spots in the forest, an isolated moment of life, a sense of hope, when even in the darkest place in the forest, there is always some hope. Much like in human life, there can always be some hope. And the sense of being stripped naked by the elk who ate all the bark off a tree. Sexual attraction, birth, heartbreak, grief, veiled contact, aging together, adjustments in time and light, allegory of marriage, dignity, a tree hit by lightning, a spirit in a tree, and learning to fly in the forest. So was this apophenia on the road to schizophrenia, or is it creativity? I knew that form evokes feeling, and feeling conjures metaphor. Metaphor demands expression. So I began to take pictures of small pieces of earth or land just to show that these same 5 forms were on the land as they were in the pond. And since photographs are indisputable but paintings are interpretive, I wanted to show the two. And as I walked around the world, there were certain patterns that we are all familiar with, but there they were everywhere in the world, including the tree of life and that which denotes affection. Men, faces, man and woman, animals, and that which seemed supernatural. And shapes that reminded me of letters. I read various languages and alphabets, and I saw these forms in high mountain lakes, at the beach, anywhere. And then it seemed that there were pictograms in front of me, like a Chinese letter or word for house, pictogram, roof over individual, or the English letter A. I began to walk around with this table of alphabet charts, the oldest alphabets ever. This chart is a bit not quite accurate now because these letter forms go back 3,500 years. And all the alphabet forms that I was photographing are the earliest ones in the history of alphabetic form worldwide. And that first column is just the beginning of at least 57 permutations of letter forms. So I took hundreds and hundreds of photographs of letter forms that could be read in all sorts of alphabets and languages. And I made books following the iterations from ancient to modern of every single letter. And I looked into the Kabbalah, which is a visualization and meditation on the form of every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, alone or in combination. Changes not only the psychophysiology of the practitioner, but is also believed to change the nature of cosmology in the moment. The frequency changes around the practitioner. And I saw groupings of letters. And eventually I was seeing words, like a child learning to read. I was reading the landscape, including the word for letter, which I found on the path in Banff. The first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is the one on the right, Aleph, and the last letter of the alphabet is this one, the Taf. Together they make the word Ot, which means letter. I can only tell you that was a pretty heavy-duty epiphany in my life. And I was startled to find that the last form of the first letter, Aleph, is the same as the first form of the last letter, Taf. Wasn't this the same cyclical event that's found in DNA? What if it were true that nature speaks in signs and that the secret to understanding its language consists in noticing similarities in shape? Look at the form. And as healers, you do this all the time. So I was still stumped, why was it, as I traveled around the world and I saw and read all these different alphabets, they all use the same 5 forms. And finally, one day, I got it. It's that our hardwired neurons are the same wherever we are, whatever culture we're from. And so those hardwired neurons that deal with perception and cognition recognize the forms outside that are closest to them. As our ancestors ubiquitously searched for food or foe, certain forms leaped out at them, those reflecting the hardwired neurons and neural processes of perception and cognition. Reciprocal relationship between observer and observed, perceiver and perceived. Each is changed by the other. So in 1982, I was invited to present my now called theory at a scientific conference, 100 scientists, and I thought I would be just booed off. But it was accepted, and it has a name. And after that conference, I was invited all over the world to present this idea. And I traveled with 4 slide projectors, and you may remember how unwieldy that was. So eventually I made a movie, an hour-long movie of this discovery process. And then in 2000, I was asked to make a movie for kids of all ages, extrapolating the main idea. And that movie was released in 2019 and has won 5 film festivals in the last couple of years. So I understood that recognition of and by familiar form is a reflective process, life-affirming. And I was asking, and I still do we see because of how we think, or do we think because of how we see? We universally recognize external forms in the same way because they reflect our hardwired perceptual apparatus. We give meaning to form in cultural context. In 86, 87, I spent a year in 15 Asian countries. Oriental was finally demystified, and I was studying alphabets, languages, cultures, medicine, shamanism, and I found that the medication of the West had turned to the meditation of the East. I also understood that belief systems are random, contextual, and convenient, and joy is culturally determined. Grief is experienced universally in the same way. Joy that's dictated by culture is different. In one, you want many husbands, in another, many wives, in one, many sons, the other daughters. Sexual preference changes everywhere, and the gods change every 5 kilometers. But grief is experienced exactly the same, with loss of contact, rejection, and abandonment. And this became an important teaching of that travel. While cultures vary widely, we are fundamentally more alike than we are different. In the East, secular is sacred. Conscious interactive seeing form changes psychophysiology. In the West, power of imagery only is recognized as erotic form, called pornography. And that's the only place pretty much in the West that everybody knows this particular image is going to cause this particular reaction. But everything we see causes a reaction. In Tibetan iconography, sex is the combination of wisdom and compassion. And the mandala is used to integrate all of the rough edges. And the medicine Buddha is the one we approach to think about healing ourselves. And Navajo and Hopi Indians make sand mandalas with healing imagery, so the patient lies down on the image and becomes healed. Also, ritual dance is practiced in so many cultures where just seeing the dancer will realign the patient. This is also practiced in Bhutan and in many tribes in Africa. Just seeing someone who you believe has a lot of positive power is going to change your shot of serotonin and endorphins and other positive neurotransmitters. Just seeing these pictures is going to cause a change in you. Similarly, anything you think is beautiful is going to cause a psychophysiological change in you. And architecture, particularly that which mirrors the human body, makes a feeling of comfort and ease and relaxation. That's why arches have always been a high commodity architecturally. But unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, but in the last 25 years where things have become much more angled and they're not quite as comforting. I spent 16 months alone in a high mountain forest in northeastern Arizona, 9,000 feet. I started out living in a yurt. I left all the comforts of home. I adopted my deer personality. 2 of my last names both mean deer in different languages. I lived with the big animals and also the small ones like the scorpions. The forest became my cathedral. I read the trees. I was all alone. And I was so alone that during the largest forest fire, the chiggers, these tiny no-see-ums, crawled into my eyeballs for the liquid and made me blind for a while. And then winter came, and I moved into a slightly more sturdy yurt, but went down to 25 below, and I moved into this wooden shack about 20 by 25 feet. And I covered the outside with visqueen to keep the wind out. And the big animals used to come every day and sharpen up their horns and racks on the visqueen, and we all knew each other. I was just another animal in the forest. There was no heat or power, and I had to collect snow every day to have enough water. A tiny baby bobcat adopted me, and he came home to me every night and slept in my hair. And he kept on sleeping in my hair, except he grew to the size of a small bear, actually. But he kept sleeping with his paw on my head and the rest of him on the floor beside me. I never fed him. He learned to hunt. And my paintings there went deep into the subconscious. I was examining my place as a human in terms of where do we belong in nature. In the spring, I walked with bears. I learned that we are herding animals. It's only within our herd that we can be heard. But be aware of the space between and the reflection from one to the other. After 10 months, I felt I was a tabula rasa. I had come and learned whatever I had to learn. I felt that I was a shadow of the reflection of the substance. And I thought I was ready to die. And as it turned out, I found out that there was a pipe, a propane pipe, that was under the floor that had burst through the floor and was leaking propane into the cabin that was sealed off with visqueen. Well, okay, that's it, I'm gone. And so I lay down, dressed in everything I had, in my sleeping bag, and ready to die. And I dreamed that I saw myself in this position, and that the man who had saved me miraculously when I was in the snowbank in the Sierras was in the dream. And he said to me, "You must get through this one in the snow too, Gilah." And I woke up and I realized, well, I dreamed the dream. My will to live is far greater than my will to die. And everything changed in that split second. All that had been a burden became a gift, the gift of life. A month later, I was invited by the Dalai Lama to come to Dharamsala, India, to be present when any Dalai Lama, he was the only one who gave tantric teachings of compassion. So I left my snow-covered mountaintop, went off to the other snow-covered mountaintop, sat with 300 monks in very cold weather. But we were shown and taught how to make our bodies warm by visualizing heat. And I'm going to use the word visualizing, although I respected the caveat this morning. But pretty much everything I do has to do with visualization. And we were taught to visualize tigle, white spheres of vital essences, which are of two types, absolute and relative. And we were shown that we should visualize this white sphere starting up here at the crown chakra, and then moving down one side of the body, nourishing all cells, systems, and organs, and coming up the other side and out the top crown chakra to benefit all sentient beings, universally, cosmically. We were taught to have the intention of doing the practice for the sake of the liberation of all beings. We are taught that tantric mystic physiology of the subtle body is directly related to the somatic physiology of regular medicine, which is really akin to what you do in so many ways. The visualization practice nourishes the body, speech, and mind. When you feel better, you are kinder and feel greater compassion to others. You become other-directed. You go to right action. I knew then that form, perspective, thought, belief, behavior change psychophysiology. I want to remind you that form evokes feeling, and feeling conjures metaphor, and metaphor demands expression. The visualization of meditation, that visualization and meditation is equal to medication. And those two letters of the T and the C, the tender care, are where the love resides between. Belief and trust in the reflective power of the medium and the power of placebo really came home to me with all of that. So I had already determined that recognition is proprioceptive, hardwired into physiological systems. Therefore, the paradigmatic model of contact and communication must lie submerged in our deeper recesses. If contact and communication is the glue between both animals and humans, valence attracts and stabilizes chemical combinations, and gravity tethers planets and galaxies, I believe there must be a profoundly embedded, paradigmatic, reflective model that allows us to perceive positively affective forms. I began to study cell behavior, a discernible unit of life that tends to live in groups, as do animals and humans. I learned that cells whisper together through cell membranes that vibrate in the electromagnetic field called a soliton, created by the valence of various facilitating hormones, minerals, and neurotransmitters. And calcium is essential for this to happen. With no calcium, there can be no communication. And so I show you a group of cells, the soliton, calcium comes around, they have a party, but if no calcium, they become separated and they begin to clone themselves, which is what we call cancer. Other systems of our body are also dependent on communication, like the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. When the two are working well, they are spooning or crossing each other. When they're not in communication, they are deficient, they cannot work. In psychology, psychiatry, we know that in isolation, we may develop psychopathology. We become narcissists, we talk to ourselves, we have multiple personalities. Much like our hardwired physiological systems, our search from birth is for a resonating, symmetrical reflection, not a clone. Micro to macro, all healthy organisms require reflection and communication. Particles, cells, individuals, communities, nations, galaxies, all dependent on connections. From infancy, we model behavior with mirror neurons. We want something similar, but not exactly identical. We look for congruency as two hands clasped inside each other, not identical as two hands held up against each other. We're looking for harmonious difference, much like a triad in a musical chord, necessary to incite healthy growth. The well-intentioned rub of stimulation animates emotional and behavioral evolution. Now, I was still perplexed. What about those white spheres from way back? In 1992 to 97, I did a series called The Temple of Mind, and these white spheres appeared. And they kept appearing. I didn't know where they came from. Were they worlds within worlds, or were they remnants of the bodhicitta visualization of the single white sphere? And I began to do a series that I called Diamond Series. I had, in this case, I had wood prepared in a diamond shape, and then I had canvases prepared in diamond shapes. And the spheres were there. And they kept being there. And in '99, I had a terrible accident on Queen Charlotte Island, which is an archipelago 200 miles west of Vancouver in the Pacific Ocean, the home of the Haida and Kwakiutl Indians for 15,000 years. Their culture reigns. They are a whale culture. So on that particular day, I was at the end of my research trip. I was alone on a remote road, going back to my hotel, and suddenly the steering wheel of my car took to the right, and it rolled the car over and over and over again down the embankment to the bottom of a ravine. And I was left hanging upside down in this car, crushed. And maybe I would still be there, but a nurse had preceded me on that road. And being vigilant, she had seen the car and then didn't see the car. And there were no turnoffs anywhere, and she came back and she saw the car at the bottom of the ravine. And she drove for 2 hours to the only infirmary on the island and came back with the 2 Haida EMTs. And they had just received the Jaws of Life the week before with the Japanese manual. I came into life immediately, and I began visualizing ice, blue ice, throughout my body, knowing I was very badly hurt. The 2 EMTs thought I was dead, and they couldn't get the Jaws of Life to work, and so they resorted to their indigenous culture, take off the clothes, oil up the body with whale blubber that everybody carries. So that's what they did, and they extracted me from the wreck, gave me morphine, and took me to this one-room infirmary that didn't even have an X-ray machine. It had nothing at all except morphine. So I was there for 5 days on morphine, decided time to go. I got morphine to go. And somehow I managed to get to a ferry, to a prop jet, to Vancouver, to a jet, to LA, to St. John's Hospital, to see my doctor who hand carried me to a living MRI machine where I could see all the damage in front of me. And I had compassion about what I saw inside my body, and that really made a difference. So I saw that 3 vertebrae, most of the ribs, sternum, scapula, both sides, injured hands, knees, head, heart. I had the EKG of a moribund person, and 5-millimeter bone fragments in my spinal column. I had head injuries. I was told that I would either become stupid or not quite so bright, that I would be paralyzed from the waist down because of the spinal cord fragments. I had no surgery. I went home in a full Velcro body cast, and my job was I lay there day after day with medical textbooks, looking at every single cell, system, and organ, and visualizing my own body responding, reflecting these healthy systems day after day after day. And after 2 months, I was able to walk to my studio that's upstairs, where I had these very large diamonds made, 7-foot diamonds. And I began to reconstruct my body from the inside out. And I worked first with the spinal column and the ribs and the cells and the spirit and pretty much everything that I could paint. And as I stood in front, because my whole body is being reflected in what I'm painting, I also wrote inside each of these canvases because I knew well that the more faculty one uses in a creative act, the more power one has. So I'm always looking to see what else can be added to make this more powerful. In this one, I asked who will live and who will die, which is a prayer that's said at the Jewish New Year coming up next week, actually, to ask, will I be around next year? And here I was saying it to this painting, in the painting every day. And as these white spheres appeared, they looked kind of familiar. And then I thought, oh my, it is the same pattern as the bodhicitta practice. And then it's the same pattern in acupuncture and moxibustion and meridian points. I was making medicine paintings. And the morphogens were there to lap up the detritus as needed. And then I had another canvas made, this one out of wood, to approximate open heart surgery so that I could get at the 5 millimeters in the spinal cord and I wrapped one of my other names around the spinal cord, which means refuge. And eventually those 5 millimeters attached to the vertebrae. Now, this is more than 20 years ago. I have no repercussions whatsoever from any of all of those injuries. And as I got stronger, I began to feel the power that I could hold in my heart, and I could once again look outside into nature. I wrote into every one of them. It was an important word, an affirmation. And as I was a painter, I was painting sacred light and sacred skin. The last in the diamond was called Ruach, which means both spirit and wind. And here I was seeing all the atoms and bodhicitta and calcium and all of the good stuff, all interconnected and really very alive. So I understood that there's grace in life, and we are connected on all levels. And as Laurie said the other night, we are all stardust, which is true. And there I had already been involved in psychoneuroimmunology from 1980. I was a pioneer in that world, and very much a part of the Council Grove Conference, this body of 100 scientists that meets every year, has been meeting since 1968 to study consciousness. So I was quite engaged with mind-body healing, biofeedback, visualization, intentionality, mission and purpose, belief, and placebo. And I've done a lot with placebo. So what about the spheres? I recalled the tantric teaching. I conjectured that when the Tibetan tantric healing visualizations were conceived, calcium had to be combined with bodhicitta at either the conscious or unconscious level. I knew enough about Tibetan biotheology, which is what I call it, that nothing is random. Everything is very thought out. I had been to Tibet many times. I was in the Tibetan plateau. I knew that the Himalayas were the most recent, the baby mountains, and that there was a high mollusk calcium content in the meager vegetation. And Tibetans eat only extremely high protein, high calcium diet of yak meat, cheese, and milk. And they're very healthy. They don't eat vegetables, for example, because there aren't any. But their bodies have adapted to a different diet over millennia. So I sent my conjecture to Noang Dadut Narkid, the Dalai Lama's biographer, close friend, who lived in the office next to the Dalai Lama. And he sent my idea to Geshe Gyaltsen, who is the authority on the sources of Tibetan practice. And so he said, yes, there are two types of bodhicitta. The first is the mind, Buddhahead, consciousness. The second is the physical white sphere, the bodhicitta sphere, which is calcium, and the two are connected because they facilitate the practitioner to attain Buddhahood. So that was a wonderful connection, so far away, but so close. And we really must examine all things that we may take for granted, but there's so much more meaning everywhere. So healing is a process based on acceptance of what is and visualizing what can be. It's a commitment toward integration. Healing is founded in intentionality, grounded in meaning and purpose to help others, and facilitated by visualization. Healing art is life-affirming, mirroring optimal form of healthy psychophysiology. And it has been mentioned here in the last day or so that many hospitals are using guided imagery before, during, and after surgeries, and the rate of healing is magnified immensely. So often I've told my students, my art students, that the first 4 letters of the word paint spell pain. And we are looking for our art to transcend pain through paint. We have a responsibility. Art now as a healing process in community. And now I'll show you various examples of how I've used art to heal in various conditions and situations. So in '08, I was invited by the Sunshine Foundation to come and hang out with their kids. Now, they have been asking famous people to come and sign autographs, and I refused to do that. I said I would only come if I can work with them. And this is what I need. And they were shocked, because nobody had ever said anything about wanting to work with the kids. The kids are terminally ill, and they know they have cancer. They don't know what kind. But they're given all kinds of perks because they're terminally ill. So they're proud about being terminally ill. There's no reason for them to get better, because being terminally ill, they go visit the president in Washington, they go to Disneyland, they get picked up in chauffeured limousines. Why would they want to get well? So I told them my story, and I stood behind the skeleton, and I wiggled the skeleton around and showed, I have one of those in me, and you have one of those in you. And I had every kid stand with the skeleton and manipulate it so that they just were radiant with joy. I have one of those, a sense of entitlement, ownership, necessary. So in addition to the skeleton, I required all sorts of art materials, and for every child, a 6-foot piece of paper on the wall. And then they would be penciled into the paper facing forward, life-size. Each child came with a helper or a therapist, and they were rewarded for their having cancer, but they really knew nothing about their cancer. Kids are kept ignorant. And they were told to reconstruct their body with healthy organisms, and every child got a medical textbook that I got from the hospital. Every single child had their own book, full color. And they were thrilled to be able to recognize that inside them there were all this interesting stuff, and they could have control over that. There was tremendous enthusiasm. And the workshop was supposed to be 2 hours. It went to 5 hours, and nobody wanted to leave. So they now had meaning and purpose. They didn't have to die to have meaning. They had to live to have meaning. They were artists. Their artworks were framed and exhibited in a Hollywood gallery. There was a gala opening to celebrate the artists. The works were bought by collectors. And I got calls from therapists and doctors about remissions, drug reduction, strong desire to live, proactive approach to their own healing. They want to know their bodies, become allies with their bodies, rather than fighting, blaming their bodies as traitors, helpless in the face of a dire diagnosis. They are using their energy not to battle, but to transform cancer into a healthy body. And they could become the doctor, the artist, the hockey player, the actor, the president, whoever they wanted to be. And then I was invited to Nairobi in Kenya to do the same thing at Aga Khan Hospital. But they didn't have skeleton, and they don't have medical texts for everybody. So I brought this pop-up unfolding skeleton, and I brought a bunch of medical texts, and people walked from villages far away. Over 30 people came to this workshop, and I was able to get the 6-foot piece of paper, and I was able to get art supplies, but not so much, but still it was something. And everybody got penciled in, facing forward. And there was a sense of joy that was unparalleled. And you see how kind of dark it was there. This is in the hospital, a pretty dark room for a hospital. They were of all ages, and as the folks in the hospital heard what was going on, everybody came in. The staff came in, the doctors came in. Everybody thought, what a good thing they're doing. And what was surprising to me was that there was so much collaboration between the participants that I had not seen in the one in LA. But here, there was a real sense of helping and concern about each other. And then I suggested that they adorn their images with things that they love, any kind of words, any kind of jewelry, or anything that they felt they would like to have around them as they continue to live long lives. And this is George Owiti, who's a 39-year-old biochemist with blood leukemia, and he got very engaged with this. And these two little girls, first they wanted to help, and then they wanted to do it themselves, so they got penciled in. And everybody was just awash with enthusiasm and a sense of doing something useful. And George wrote me after I went home and said that now he understood the biofeedback therapy and how it would help him, and he understood what the medication was supposed to do. He could follow it in his body, and he was determined to overcome this dragon called cancer. So many people joined the workshop, and it went on into a second day. The drawings are exhibited, the positive results medically and emotionally. Body mapping is what I called it. Workshops are proliferating in the hospital, and I have a protocol if anybody wants it. I would be happy to email it to you if you email me. And the proactive approach to one's own healing, taking charge of one's body, is really important. From earliest childhood, children should be taught about their bodies. There may be a shy movie about puberty, but that's all that's officially given. Once they know how things work and that they have power over their bodies, they may not punch each other. Just think, it may curb war. Our bodies remain our biggest secret for most of us during most of our lives. The knowledge is reserved for doctors and shamans. And here I was working with women who had been raped. 9 women in this group were raped. And I had the women paired with student artists, and they interviewed each other for 2 weeks, really deep interviews, and they discovered a whole lot about each other. And at the end of the 2 weeks, the artists began painting the women, and the women regained confidence in their beauty, and a sense of joy permeated everybody. And the artist had such a sense of empathy and sympathy for what the women had gone through, and their lives were changed as well. The paintings were shown in Los Angeles and then flown to China and exhibited there, but the word rape is not allowed to be said publicly. I called this workshop Stepping into Light, and now workshops with that name have continued underground. And A Window Between Worlds are 500 shelters across U.S. for abused women and children. All therapy is based in art and visualization. Now, here's an instance where we had to heal a hospital. I was at a party for physicians and psychiatrists in Beverly Hills and asked, what's the worst hospital in LA? No problem. Watts Health Center, the worst hospital. No doctors, no patients. So I rallied my students, and we went over, and we took a look. It was crumbling. It had the highest crime rate. That's why nobody wanted to go there. And we're determined we're going to heal the hospital. So we started with OBGYN, and we were going to make these educational as well as calming murals for OBGYN. And we had the panels. We worked on the panels at the studio at the university, and then they were brought to the hospital. And in the artwork, we also wanted to have some models like Michelle Obama, a woman scientist, fathers engaged in carrying a baby, a female mathematician, grandparents. This is Watts, the worst possible oppressed area of LA, and this served as an educational event as well. And soon other departments, whoever was still left at the hospital, they wanted art. And so we then began to work with pediatrics, and the kids had to be engaged with fun. And we brought the beach all the way 20 miles to Watts. Usually kids who grow up in Watts never leave Watts. So they now had a different perspective on their city. And then radiology got really upset. What about us? We want. So we had to work with radiology. And because it was a very small waiting room, we had to, by trompe-l'oeil work, pretend that it extended way beyond itself and made murals of sports and jungles and other sorts of things. And that hospital is now booming, and everybody wants to come and bring their kids, and it's become a community center. Lower crime, and in 2009, President Obama named that project as one of the 17 best projects in the US. So finally, creativity and mental illness. Imagination is either a muse or a demon. It's a metaphor, or is it apophenia, or is it schizophrenia? And demon comes from the Hebrew word demayon, which means imagination. And daemon is the Greek derivative that means chthonic spirit. It becomes evil if we look at it as a chthonic spirit. And Hesse used Demian for the name of his very famous hero. And you are surely aware of the continuum between creativity and schizophrenia and mental illness. It's a set continuum, but it doesn't mean that anyone of extreme creativity is going to wind up as a serious schizophrenic. We have to be vigilant. And now to my mother, who I mentioned earlier, who is a famous poet, writer, and author. She left 70 diaries that covered her entire life when she died in 2002. And later was, after her death, was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And she wanted me to have the diaries. And I read the diaries over a period of many months and annotated all of the diaries, particularly where she was writing about her own illness. And she recognized that in the 13-year-old diary, she talks about her manic behavior, that she has certain moods and she leads to melancholy, and then suddenly she will be very high on a creative work. And she understood that. And she was terribly troubled. And yet, on stage, she was divine, and she was known all over Canada. It was only the people close to her that really got hit hard. And at 71, and this is after she had been hospitalized in the Allen Memorial, the Hospital for Mental Illness in Montreal, she never really was helped. And although she was given every drug that came down the pike, she just didn't respond to any of them. But here she is again at age 71. Recently, I've had lapses again. I've had, over the years, good and not so good, recorded and not recorded. But I don't think I've used it to escape into illusion or madness. If anything, it has helped me to avoid madness. And so now I would like to suggest that divinity is in humanity, spirituality is in behavior, and wisdom is understanding the consequences of our behaviors. With each breath, we have a choice whether to live or not. And if we live, we would consider helping others in this world of complexity and trouble. That question I sent to Einstein as a child still reigns, and there's a lot of work to do. Or if we die, we imagine that we go somewhere where there are no problems. Our big brains are always looking for answers. We are perpetually looking for the grail. And even when we think we almost find it, it is way too elusive. We'll never get there. We keep looking for clarity. We build edifices to house our books of knowledge from all time, hoping to get hit by a bolt of lightning and therefore have all the knowledge in the universe. We look to science for answers. We look to mysticism and religion for answers. The main book of the Kabbalah, which is called Zohar, meaning splendor, it also means be aware, be careful, pay attention. These three letters, pronounced two ways, give you the duality of splendor and horror. We imagine parallel universes. We imagine multiple universes. We think that somewhere on some other galaxy or some other planet, life is perfect, or multidimensional spaces will give us all sorts of freedom, or maybe it's interspecies communication. But we know that we are riding bareback on each other's souls. And the more we understand the nature of reflection, the more we understand each other. We are vulnerable and we are powerful, and we are dependent on each other. And we're more alike each other than we're different. And as we face time and face our mortality, we become the architecture and the archaeology of the future. And as our souls slip by, unseen, untethered, we see them also looking for answers. And whenever we are asked to wear masks in any generation, it's for a different reason, but always so that we have to dig deeper and learn more about each other, and we will always recognize each other in light. Thank you. I'm very, very touched and moved by your response. Thank you.
There are some books and DVDs that are out in the lobby area, and Gilah would be there. So if you're so wish to take some of this work with you. Okay. Thank you so much. What? Do you have a question?
Yes, I'll do it right now. Okay, so it's Gilah, Gilah, at gilah.com. And I will be happy to answer any questions, and I get email, a great deal of email every day from all over the world, people asking the same questions. And I'm looking for the answers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm really honored to have presented this with this group. Thank you.
And Gilah will be with us the rest of the conference. Yeah.